In the second lecture of the series on the English novel, we examine how prose fiction begins to take recognizable shape in the 18th century. Focusing on key writers from Defoe to Smollett, the lecture traces how realism, satire, moral inwardness, narrative control, and formal experimentation emerge not as a single model, but as a set of competing possibilities that together establish the novel as a viable literary form. As we saw in the first lecture, early prose fiction develops out of a mixed field of writing practices that borrow authority from journalism, travel writing, memoir, and report, rather than from inherited literary forms. Daniel Defoe emerges at this point as a crucial turning figure because his narratives fully exploit this factual voice while redirecting it towards sustained fictional experience. Defoe's prose presents itself as truthful not through artistic symmetry or psychological analysis, but through circumstantial accumulation, work performed day after day, objects handled repeatedly, calculations made, mistakes corrected, and survival gradually secured. Credibility rests on repetition, duration, and material persistence rather than on inward reflection or symbolic meaning. Characters, such as Robinson Crusoe, are defined by endurance, utility, and adaptation to circumstance, not by introspection or moral debate. Life is shown as something managed over time, shaped by labor, environment, and necessity. In this way, Defoe transforms the techniques of non-fictional prose into a new kind of fictional authority, making ordinary activity narratively significant. At the same time, his narratives remain formally loose and episodic, closer to journal or report than to carefully designed plot. What matters is not structural elegance, but experiential pressure, the sense that life unfolds through contingency rather than through design. Defoe thus demonstrates how prose fiction can claim authority by imitating factual discourse while inventing experience. The novel here doesn't yet announce itself as art. It asserts itself as plausible life rendered in narrative form. Running alongside Defoe's circumstantial realism is Jonathan Swift's satirical use of the same factual voice, one that exposes how unstable and morally dangerous its claims to authority can be. Swift adopts the language of empirical observation, travel narrative, and rational report, but uses it to undermine confidence in reason, measurement, and progress, rather than to secure belief in them. His narratives maintain a calm, controlled tone, even as the worlds they describe become increasingly cruel, grotesque, or absurd. This mismatch is central to satire. It prevents reader identification and enforces critical distance. Experience in Swift's fiction doesn't accumulate towards coherence or improvement, but toward the exposure of contradiction and moral emptiness. Where Defoe presents rational labor and calculation as workable responses to circumstances, Swift shows how rational systems can coexist with violence and inhumanity. He relies on realism's techniques precisely to reveal their limits, demonstrating that plausibility does not guarantee moral truth. With Samuel Richardson, the novel decisively turns inward, treating private experience as the primary site of moral meaning. Richardson's fiction assumes that sincerity, conscience, and emotional struggle are the most reliable foundations of ethical truth, and his narratives immerse the reader in the minute process of feeling, hesitation, and self-examination. Moral life unfolds through endurance rather than action, as moments of fear, doubt, and desire are expanded and given narrative weight. Time becomes psychologically dense, stretched by reflection and anxiety rather than propelled by event. Richardson's method narrows perspective deliberately, often confining the reader to a single consciousness so completely that moral experience appears intense, claustrophobic, and inescapable. This inward focus grants unprecedented seriousness to private life, insisting that what is felt internally has ethical significance. At the same time, this intensity exposes a potential danger. Moral authority risks becoming indistinguishable from emotional immediacy. Richardson thus establishes moral inwardness as a central novelistic resource, while also revealing the strains such inwardness places on narrative balance and judgment. Henry Fielding's fiction emerges in direct opposition to Richardson's inward moral authority, insisting that ethical understanding cannot rest solely on private feeling. Fielding rejects the idea that sincerity guarantees moral truth and instead emphasizes distance, perspective, and social judgment as essential narrative principles. His novels are shaped by a governing narrative intelligence that observes, comments, and evaluates characters from an external vantage point. Moral meaning arises not from emotional intensity, but from the reader's ability to see behavior in relation to a shared social world. Irony, control, narrative commentary function here as safeguards against the excesses of inward absorption. Where Richardson's novels draw the reader into intimate identification, Fielding's novels encourage reflection, comparison, and judgment. Yet this is not a retreat from seriousness. It is rather an insistence that moral life is public as well as private, shaped by social interaction and visible conduct. In Fielding's work, the novel asserts its capacity to regulate feeling through form, demonstrating that ethical understanding requires both sympathy and distance. Just as the novel appears to be stabilizing around moral inwardness and narrative control, it is deliberately unsettled by the work of Laurence Sterne. Sterne's fiction resists the assumption that narrative should move steadily forward or that meaning should emerge through orderly development. Instead of progress, Tristram Shandy offers delay, interruption, and digression as organizing principles. The story repeatedly postpones its own beginning, expanding trivial moments while deferring significant events indefinitely. This treatment of time challenges the idea that narrative coherence depends on sequence or causality. Sterne draws constant attention to the act of narration itself, making the reader aware of artifice rather than concealing it. Language is treated as playful, unstable, and suggestive, undermining transparency and authority. Meaning arises not from plot or moral design, but from tone, rhythm, and association. Yet Sterne's disruption doesn't destroy the novel. It demonstrates that the form can question its own conventions and still function as narrative. The novel's flexibility is confirmed rather than weakened. Sterne shows that realism and structure are not compulsory laws, but options within a form capable of sustaining experience without losing identity. Completing the 18th century formation of the novel is the contribution associated with Tobias Smollett, whose fiction extends prose narrative toward physicality, incident, and social variety. Smollett's novels emphasize movement, travel, and encounter, filling narrative space with a wide range of settings, professions, and social types. Experience is presented as energetic and often abrasive, shaped by bodily exposure, accident, and confrontation, rather than by inward reflection or moral design. This emphasis broadens the novel's representational reach, bringing into view forms of life that lie beyond domestic interiors or polite society. Narrative momentum is driven by episode rather than structure, and coherence arises from accumulation rather than from pattern. Smollett's realism is rough and immediate, grounding in sensation and action rather than introspection or irony. This contribution is indispensable. It prevents the novel from narrowing itself to either moral inwardness or formal control alone. By incorporating vigor, disorder, and social breadth, the novel demonstrates its ability to contain heterogeneous experiences within a single narrative form. Smollett's work thus confirms that the novel's strength lies not in refinement alone, but in its capacity to register the full range of lived experience. From the early works of Defoe and Swift to the more developed forms of Richardson, Fielding, Sterne, and Smollett, the novel reaches a point of functional completeness rather than formal unity. What matters isn't agreement among these writers, but the fact that each supplies a narrative capacity the form requires in order to sustain itself. Moral inwardness, narrative control, social breadth, and formal play coexist without being reconciled into a single model. The novel becomes fully equipped precisely through this coordination of divergent energies, demonstrating its ability to move inward and outward, toward feeling and toward society, toward order and toward disruption, without breaking apart. This moment doesn't mark closure or exhaustion, but readiness, enabling the broad expansion of normalization of prose fiction in the later 18th century. Alongside the major figures, a large body of minor figures adapts and repeats these established methods, relying on familiar plots and recognizable moral situations. Although artistically uneven, this repetition proves decisive. Through sheer quantity, prose fiction becomes an accepted cultural practice, training readers in sustained narrative and securing the novel's authority as the dominant form of extended prose narrative. So by the end of the 18th century, the novel has not yet settled into a single formula, but it has acquired the essential capacities it needs to endure. Through the combined contributions of Defoe, Swift, Richardson, Fielding, Sterne, and Smollett, prose fiction demonstrates its ability to represent ordinary life, probe moral experience, register social breadth, and question its own conventions. The novel's strength lies not in consensus, but in coordination, a form flexible enough to contain contradiction, repetition, and expansion, and stable enough to become the dominant mode of extended prose narrative. For more information, refer to the works listed on the screen.